Erwin Cornips, who is a very long supporter, very long-standing supporter of our research activities here in Homburg, is willing to get us an idea of his own approach, because he's a typical clinical researcher. So he did a lot of particular procedures. I mean, I don't know what the topic is going to be, but it's maybe endoscopic spine, or it might be endoscopic pediatric, or it might be pituitary. I have no idea, but he did a lot of clinical procedures. And he has actually just finished his PhD thesis in Belgium. And I think he's an ideal candidate for getting us the idea on how to plan a research concept, how to project and PhD when you are basically, relying on clinical data. So, Erwin, I think it's your duty now to start. And we have a presentation, and then we have hopefully a vivid discussion. And then later on, only those of the research committee, we have another 30 minutes webinar to discuss the further steps. Erwin, it's all
okay. Okay, thank you so much for your kind introduction, Joachim. I worked for 20 years in the Netherlands. I was born and raised and trained in Belgium, but I worked in the Netherlands in Maastricht, where I was a pediatric neurosurgeon. Now I changed. I came back to my home country for 4 years, and I work in a private hospital now. But we'll be starting in Brussels in a university hospital 1 day a week very soon. So I missed the research, and I want to continue those projects. Indeed, I have always done clinical research from the working floor. So no big money projects, no things that were discussed for weeks or for months and planned with companies and so big budgets, but just clinical research that all of us should be able to do from the daily work floor. You see an interesting case, or you collect a few cases, you try to find a pattern, and you follow your literature, of course, and then you see the gap of knowledge in the literature, and you might be able to add something to that with your own findings, and then you start making the concept of a paper. That's what I want to share with you. Also, I've always been somebody who was very interested in language, how things are formulated. That has always been some of my strengths. I think things are changing because we have artificial intelligence now that will help us writing papers. Those of us that have ideas but may not be that interested in writing themselves or in finding the right words and sentences, they may be able to use artificial intelligence in the near future. But I'm going to elaborate on that just a little bit. I'm going to show you my way, the way I did it for the past 25 years. Let's see if I can go to another slide now. How do we do that? Just clicking. Okay, writing, I think, should always be meaningful. It should always be honest, and it should always be fun. So finding a topic that you like to talk about, that you're passionate about, that's very interesting, very important, especially when you start writing. And another thing, sharing your research is essential. It's the most essential part of the research is sharing it with the community, with the scientific community, and with your peers worldwide. There are some dangers. This is a paper from Nature. More than 10,000 research papers were retracted only in 2023, a new record. I'm going to slide you up, Joachim, because you're in my way on the screen. And integrity experts say this might only be the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot of research now that is maybe not being done or being shared correctly. And we should, of course, we don't want to be part of that. Writing takes a clear idea and preferably an original idea. I do a lot of reviewing of papers, and I find it we all may have the problem of repeating ourselves and repeating other colleagues. An example, maybe third ventriculostomy. Some 10, 15 years ago, sharing results of third ventriculostomy. At some point, everybody started sharing his or her results, and it was always the same message being repeated over and over again from different institutions. At some point, it's enough. Try to find an original idea and try to share that. There's already so much bulk in the literature that we are all long for an original idea, something new, something interesting. So writing takes an original idea, preferably, focus, and above all, time. The sooner you start, the better. Start early in your research process. Start already with an outline of your paper. Put some ideas on paper. Don't wait. Start as soon as possible. In that regard, it's of course also obvious you have to start early in your discussion with the ethical or institutional review board to get approval. Ethical research should be honest, it should be rigorous, and it should be transparent. It should be respectful towards the subjects of the study. It should protect participants. They should be able to know who is looking at the data and what they are being used for. And of course, in principle, it will not always be maybe like that, but in principle, you need IRB or ERB approval before you actually start to collect your data. Different steps in preparing your paper are preparing steps, the writing, the editing, the revising, and then finishing it up, preparing it for actual submission. During that process, always keep the reader in mind. Keeping the reader in mind reminds you why you are writing it down. Why am I doing all this time? Why am I spending all this time, free time, evening time, night time, weekend time? Well, keep the reader in mind. The people that will enjoy reading your paper. This will keep you motivated and this will keep you inspired. It's for me, it works. Just one slide about artificial intelligence. During the preparation of this talk, I thought, oh, I have to look at artificial intelligence because things are rapidly changing, and I found an overwhelming amount of papers already on artificial intelligence and scientific research and publishing papers. On the left, a paper on the role of artificial intelligence in scientific writing. I need to put on my glasses now so I can read these tiny little letters. Artificial intelligence has the potential to improve the quality and efficiency of the writing process. However, there also are raised a number of ethical concerns, including the potential for job loss and the proliferation of fake or misleading content. Obvious, but of concern. On the right, another paper, the use of artificial intelligence to improve the scientific writing of non-native English speakers. AI tools will help non-native English speakers to improve the clarity, style, and coherence of their writing. And then there are some programs like Mendeley, Grammarly, Research Rabbit that can be used and that can be particularly helpful for non-native English speaking scientists. Of course, that can be great and that can be of great help. It's something I personally don't have any experience with. And a funny note, in the yellow circle, the authors show in their disclosure they actually used artificial intelligence to make the introduction and the conclusion of this paper. So they wrote the discussion, artificial intelligence made the introduction and the conclusion. So back to the actual writing process. First step, find and define the gap of knowledge. What is the thing we are interested in? What is the question, the research question? What don't we know and what do we want to learn something about? What do I want to tell? What is my key message? What point or points do I want to make? So that famous gap of knowledge is something you need to identify or you need to be looking for in your daily practice. Once you find a gap of knowledge, it can be a small gap, it can be a huge gap, and you feel you have something to tell about it, you found a beautiful topic for an interesting paper all clinicians will be interested in. Second thing, find a good title. I tend to make different titles, some 5, 6, 7, sometimes 10 titles, and I all put them on top of my paper in my computer, and then I start working on them. And then I stop, and then a few days later, I look again at the titles, I skip a few, I make another one. So the title is not something that comes spontaneously. You try to formulate your idea in different ways, and then you look at it, you read it again, until you have a very good title. Titles are important because together with the abstract, they are the first thing that pops up on PubMed, and that should trigger interest of the readership to look for your paper and to start actually reading the paper. So a good title reflects the purpose of the paper. It arouses the interest of the readers. It includes important keywords because you want your paper through your title to be found if a certain topic is searched for, then you want your paper to be found. So some important keywords need to be in the title, and avoid waste words. So avoid long titles like observations on. These words say nothing. Try to be concise and to the point. These are just some of my titles. I just took the first 3 ones I found. The clinical spectrum of Blake's pouch cyst, report of 6 illustrative cases. I put in between brackets because the latter part of the sentence actually doesn't add anything. The clinical spectrum of Blake's pouch cyst. So the paper will describe you different clinical presentations of that same entity. One entity that can present in different ways. You only need 6 or 7 words to make your point and to attract the reader's interest. This was actually the first paper worldwide that was only talking about Blake's pouch cyst. And therefore, with that in the title, everybody would be able to find the paper. Below is a long title, and I remember it's 10 years ago I wrote the paper that I was struggling to find a good title. For me, it's still too long, but it's about crippling upper back pain after motor vehicle collisions caused by thoracic disc herniations. This was a new idea. Nobody ever talked about it. So we always think upper back pain, neck pain after motor vehicle collisions, that's part of a whiplash mechanism, that's muscular. But the new thing was, the new observation, it can be related to pre-existing thoracic disc herniations. So thoracic disc herniations needed to be in the title, motor vehicle collisions needed to be in the title, and upper back pain. And then crippling to add some drama to the title. And then whiplash. Why whiplash? Because all too often this pain is attributed to a whiplash and not to thoracic disc herniation. So I needed that in the titles so as to enable researchers, authors, colleagues, when they were struggling with a patient with upper back pain after motor vehicle collision, to find my paper. So I had to have these 4 things in the title. So I couldn't make it differently. Crippling upper back pain after whiplash and other motor vehicle collisions caused by thoracic disc herniations. So sometimes the title needs to be a little longer, but be critical and formulate and reformulate. On the right, just another one, fatal hemorrhagic infarction after thoracoscopic microdiscectomy. This was a case with a dural tear that was not identified during surgery. So there was a pleural fistula from CSF into the pleural cavity. And before we had the diagnosis, the patient had died because of hemorrhagic infarction in the supra and infratentorial compartment. It's a rather short title that tells everything. So I think it's a good title that also attracts the interest of possible readers. So you start with a comprehensive literature search. Then you make your preliminary outline that is, I think, quite obvious. The title, as we discussed, the authors, who will be author, who will be co-author, what will the different authors do, and then also the order, which is something that is often forgotten or postponed, but I think you make good friends by discussing the order of the paper from the start. That also helps you in deciding who is going to do what, and if you are second or last, there may be another expectation level on your contribution than when you are 4th or 5th or 6th author. So talk, it shouldn't take long, but discuss that matter with your co-authors at the beginning. Then you write down the sections, of course also a reference section, and this preliminary outline is the first start that helps you organize your thoughts. In the old days, we used to have paper. Now we have laptops. And you can, everything that pops up in your mind, whether it has to do with the introduction, whether it has to do with the results, whether it has to do with the discussion, and so on, you can just put it provisory, can put it there, not to forget, because those tiny little details that make your paper more interesting and more fluent to read, you may tend to forget them when you are really analyzing the results. But when they pop up in your mind, put them in the right section, and you can always start working on them later on. So first step, start organizing your thoughts. You can work on different sections in parallel. And another thing, of course, follow the journal instructions from the beginning. This will save you a lot of time and effort. If you would not have done that, you would have to restart at some point. Then, of course, you have to complete your database. And going through cases has always helped me conceptualizing my paper. If you are talking about hydrocephalus, if you are talking about thoracic disc herniation, but if you're talking about pituitary cases or cervical foraminotomy, anything, you would all agree, I think, as clinicians, every case is a little bit different. And going through your cases, completing your database, helps you conceptualizing the paper. Oh yeah, that's specific for this case, and we see that maybe in 10% of cases. I mustn't forget to talk about that. You just take it out, put it in the right section. Just a keyword or a small sentence. I have to tell something about that at some point during my further writing process. So you can add your notes to the initial outline of the paper, especially things you may at some point forget. Not only complete your database, but when going through the cases, you can also look at the images of different cases, trying to find that very nice, very beautiful image that would be most illustrative for your paper. On the right, just a paper that, just an image I found in one of my papers, just one of the first images. For me, I have always tried to show pre and post-op images that are so identical. There's no discussion whatsoever. It's the same case, it's the same patient, it's the same level. All too often I see papers like tumor resection in children, posterior fossa tumors, and then you see sagittal sections pre and post-op that are really not in line, which makes it very, very hard to believe it's the same case, or to estimate the amount of resection. Try to look for the optimal cases. And some cases are just not suited because the angulation of the scan is different. But then if you have different cases, try going through your database, try to find the nice images. Nice images are a beautiful adjunct to your paper. And I think clinically oriented readers will enjoy them as well. Remember, surgeons, I think most of you now in the audience are surgeons, if not all. Surgeons have visual brains, so images are very important. Make the images comparable, and you may consider adding images to the initial outline, so to make it visual for you also while writing your paper. And then another thing which has always greatly helped me, I've almost always done it like that, make a PowerPoint presentation early in the process. Somehow, especially when you have a clinical paper, not a review paper, but a clinical paper, you are telling your story or your institution's story. These were the data, this is our experience, this is how we did it, this is what we found, this is our conclusion. So making a presentation helps you to conceptualize the paper. And if you have a presentation, you put it in the small slide mode, you can start shuffling the slides. So like a story, you reshuffle the slides so the story is more easy to follow. It's like storytelling. Also, making the presentation helps you to decide which tables you need, which figures you need. It also helps you to reveal any shortcomings, things that data you may not have, or shortcomings that are somehow missing in the story. And it also is a great tool to receive initial feedback, because you can address an audience in your institution, your peers, your colleagues, your mentor. You can show the presentation. This is my idea. This is my preliminary concept of the paper. Do you agree, or does anybody have a suggestion? So it has always greatly helped me, and also already put some figures and put some pictures in. So it's a sneak preview of your paper, even if you don't have all the data already at hand. Second step, writing. As I already told you, producing a paper is an integral part of the research process. You don't only do the research, you also want to publish and spread your results. So think, plan, and start early to clarify your thoughts, and don't wait for all results. You can start writing early. You can start collecting references. You can start making a nice introduction. Why did we think about doing this research? You can do many things in parallel. Don't wait for all results to come in to start writing. And for those of you with a writer's block, start writing the easy parts first, the parts that are more easy for you, like an introduction. Start there, or start with analyzing some results and keep the introduction for later. There's no one strict rule how to write a paper from A to Z. Importantly, avoid duplication. That's a significant pitfall that you, especially in the introduction and in the discussion, you start repeating yourself. If you see you start repeating yourself going through your preliminary paper, then something is wrong. Then either you take it out of the first part or you take it out of the second part, but avoid duplication. Be aware of that. It makes your paper lengthy and unnecessarily lengthy. Next thing, prepare your next session. It always takes, I think you would all agree, it always takes time to start writing, especially after a few days. You sit down, you want to start writing, and it's like, oh, where do I start? If you prepare your next session at the end of the previous session by just putting out some keywords, you are in the flow, you have been working a day or maybe even a weekend on your paper, and then the next will be maybe in a week, but you already have an idea, I want to write that part. I want to write about that. And you have some keywords in your, or some preliminary outline, put it down. It will be of great help next time when you start, you immediately have something to start working on. It works, at least it works for me. Now I want to discuss very briefly the different parts of the paper, just very shortly, just a few slides. What are the most important items for each section of the paper? The introduction should provide the background for your research, the context. Ask yourself these questions. What is already known, including your own previous research? There's nothing wrong referring to your own previous research. Nothing wrong with that. What is not known? What is the gap of knowledge? And then, very importantly, what should the average reader already know at the onset of your paper? What is the basic information needed to go with the flow to understand your paper? You can put that in your introduction, of course, with the necessary references. And then finally, what does your study aim to address? And then clearly state your hypothesis or your research question at the end of your introduction. Second, material and methods. You describe how the study was conducted. This is a more easy part. You mention who was involved, which participants, what tools or instruments were used, and go into detail. Mention the company, go into enough detail so everybody knows what you are talking about. How was the study carried out, and how were the data analyzed? In this part, in this section, you should provide enough details to allow replication, except, of course, when you write a review paper. But even with a review paper, you have to tell everybody at the beginning of your paper how the review was conducted, what PubMed search you did, what were the terms that were used to do your paper search. So also there, you have to provide enough details to allow replication. Then the results section, of course, that's quite obvious. You present your study findings using text, tables, figures, statistical analysis. I'm not going to talk about statistics. I'm not a great specialist regarding statistics, but there are people who are, and especially the younger people, the people that are trained more recently. And nowadays, my son is studying medicine. He is a much better statistician than I am. So ask help from those people who know how to analyze, especially big data, and to implement statistics into your research. Also do that early. For the results, it's classical to use the past tense. We had 12 patients. We observed bleeding in 2 of them. So you use the past tense in the results section. Importantly, be clear, be concise, and above all, avoid interpretation. When you start interpreting your results, you are in the discussion. If you're in the flow and you feel like, okay, I'm starting to do that, you do that, but then you cut that section and you copy paste it into your discussion. This brings me to the discussion that gives an interpretation of the results, but not only that, you also discuss the implications of the research. So ask yourself these questions. What do the results mean? How do they fit into the broader picture? You use the past tense when you're talking about your results, and you use the present tense when you are talking about other results that other authors published, and also when you are giving your own interpretation. It may sound weird, but I'm not going to do it now, but ask yourself, try to talk about your results. That's in the past tense. When you start analyzing them, you switch to the present tense. It's done like that in most, if not all, papers, if you're doing it correctly. Finally, at the end of the discussion, please report your study limitations and also consider suggesting some or giving some suggestions for future research. If you don't report your study limitations, this is the first thing the reviewers will pinpoint. You have to do that. So it may be of help to do some introspection and to write down already some study limitations. And again, you can find them while collecting your data, while writing them down, while starting with the discussion. If you see something that might sound like a study limitation, take it out, put it at the end of the discussion, and work on it when you finalize your paper. Finally, at the end of the discussion, always link back to the introduction and the hypothesis you have given there. And so close the loop, and that way it's a nice closed loop paper. Don't forget that. So go back to your introduction. How did I finish my introduction? And go back to that point at the end of your discussion. And then you come to the conclusion that summarizes the main findings of your research and their significance. You highlight the key findings. You also highlight their importance as analyzed in the discussion. You consider suggesting future research very briefly, just 1 or 2 sentences, and do not refer to the literature anymore in your conclusion. I have not frequently seen that, but I have occasionally seen people referring to the literature in the conclusion. That is normally not done. Be brief and to the point. And then finally, the abstract. The abstract is actually often the first thing we write. We have to go to a congress in 2-3 months. We want to present something there. We start writing the abstract because we have to submit it. And then we tend to keep that abstract for the final paper. There's nothing wrong writing the abstract early. You describe the problem and you summarize your major research points. You clearly state your objective. You avoid unnecessary words. In your paper, you can use more words, connecting words, and it needs to be easy to read, but the abstract should be very succinct. Every word counts in the abstract because there's a word count, often 250 words, sometimes a little bit more or even a little bit less for congresses. So you have to avoid unnecessary words. It's an art by itself, how to write an abstract, but you will get better by it, and you make it, and then you start skipping words to make it more compact. And as I said, abstract tends to be made early in the writing process, but you should consider revising your abstract at the end. And in doing that, you can use key lines from each section of your paper. That works fine for me. You just go through your introduction. What is the 1 or 2 most important sentences in your introduction? Copy paste them to the abstract. Then you go to the material methods. You go to the results. You go to the discussion. You do the same. So you have copy pasted 8 or 10 sentences, and then you start making them more compact, skipping the unnecessary words. And there it is. You have your abstract. Especially if it's a paper on selected cases or relatively few cases. Sometimes you have a paper with a lot of statistics, and then this may not work. And then it's more, what are the most relevant data, numbers, and statistics to put in the abstract. But for many papers, the papers I have written, most of the papers I wrote, this worked perfectly. Another important remark, an abstract should be able to stand alone. Even if you don't have the paper, somebody doesn't have access to your paper because the institution doesn't have access to that publication, the abstract should be able to stand alone. It should be understandable without having the paper next to you. And as does the title, the second important thing is the abstract to determine whether your paper will be read. Okay, so spend some time and make the abstract as attractive and as readable as possible. Some examples. I told you I was a pediatric neurosurgeon for 20 years. I still think this is a nice title. Childhood angular kyphosis. A plea for involvement of the pediatric neurosurgeon. At some point, I discovered that kyphosis, so kyphotic spine curvature abnormalities, tended to be treated and diagnosed and analyzed by pediatric orthopedic surgeons without specific neurosurgical know-how. And I discovered that, or I observed, that many of these cases had an underlying or associated neurosurgical problem. And I just thought I have to make a plea. The pediatric neurosurgeon should at least be involved and should be involved early to help with the diagnostics and also to help with the treating process. And then in this paper, images were very important. Without saying one word, if you look at the images, you see the deformity, a scoliotic and a kyphotic deformity. You show the X-ray, the MRI. You see a hemivertebra. You see the 3D reconstruction clearly showing the hemivertebra, which is causing the deformity. I did a thoracoscopic spinal cord decompression by resecting the hemivertebra, and then the orthopedic surgeon did a posterior stabilization. I have to go back. On the right side, myelomeningocele. Here is the VP shunt placement, closure, and then the VP shunt placement, the kyphotic deformity associated with this severe myelomeningocele case, and then the fusion. So the title, the images, they tell the story, and you just write your paper around it. Another paper I wrote a long time ago on low field intraoperative MRI. Much too long, this title. I didn't make the title. It was my former colleague, Dr. Kubben. Way too long, this title. The thing between brackets is actually not necessary. Implementation of a mobile 0.15 Tesla intraoperative MR system in pediatric neuro-oncological surgery. That tells it all. Then feasibility and correlation with early strength post-op high field strength MRI makes it a very long title. And normally, the first part of the title, I believe, is enough to trigger interest of the reader. Then also in this paper, because this was very new at the time, we were one of the first using the Polestar for pediatric cases. So we had to describe the system. So you show the system on the left, you show the coils and the head clamp and the navigation star in the middle. You show different positionings, prone and supine, and the limited shaving and the head coil around the patient. And then I showed images of all 9 cases we did. On the left column, pre-op, the second column, the intraoperative pre-resection, the third column, intraoperative post-resection, the fourth column, post-operative post-resection with high field strength MRI. And again, I carefully selected images so the reader doesn't have to look, is this the same case? I really tried to find the exact same level for every image, making interpretation much more easy. And then actually, if you have these images, you start from that setup. It was not a difficult paper to write. You just had to describe on the left the clinical characteristics. Then in the results section, whether we judged it to be a gross total resection on the intraoperative MRI, and then next to that, whether this was confirmed by the early postoperative high field strength MRI, whether there was a post-op deficit, and how long follow-up we had. And then on the bottom line, the literature on different magnet strengths for pediatric cases, the number of cases, whether there was residual tumor, what was the added value of the intraoperative MRI, and then in the red square, our present study, how does it relate to the literature? So this was not a difficult paper to write, and maybe not a very shocking conclusion, but it was new at the time, and I thought we had to show what the system could do, how the system looked like, and the preliminary experience we had in a concise paper. Just a third paper, and then I will stop, and we will move forward to some writing suggestions, some spelling and grammar suggestions before I go to my conclusions. So this is the final paper I wanted to show you. At some point, we observed, we were thinking about fever after intraventricular neuroendoscopic procedures in children, because we had the impression quite a few of these children developed fever after such procedures, but it was rarely a problem. Of course, pediatricians were very worried. 39 degrees, day one after ventriculoscopy. Oh, this may be a meningitis. Something is wrong. The child is going to die. We have to start antibiotics. Panic. Always that same reaction. But in the end, most of these children were not sick at all. So that was the basic observation. And we just wanted to communicate that to the literature, because in our observation, this had never been analyzed in the literature. Fever after intraventricular neuroendoscopic procedures in children, it's frequent. We observed it in 47 of 67 procedures. So this was the basic idea. And then we started analyzing. Only 9 of these 47 children were actually ill during the episode of fever. Most of them, the illness was not even related to the fever, but was an early sign of a dysfunctional ventriculostomy. So children that in the end needed a VP shunt. So really being really ill, having a meningitis, it was only 2 cases of these 47. So fever is frequent, post-op illness is infrequent, and most of these cases is transient, and it's nothing to worry about. Again, I showed a few images to make the story a little more nice to read, some illustrations, and again, exactly the same level pre and post-op, axial and sagittal, making it easy for the reader to see the differences before and after surgery. And then how to analyze, how to present your data. These were relatively easy data, but how to present them in a nice way for the reader so they can get the necessary information in a glance. You see that in the table on the left. What does it show? The dark gray shows fever above 38, and the light gray blocks show fever above 39, so higher fever. And we see the fever is actually on the first and second post-op day, and then the incidence goes down very rapidly. So it's early post-operative fever, which is easily grasped if you look at this figure. And then on the right, we looked for significant correlation in our cases. 20 patients had fever, 47 had, 20 had no fever, 47 had fever. And the only significant thing that came out of our analysis was that children above 1 year of age, those are the ones that often develop fever after a ventriculoscopic procedure, and children below 1 year of age, it was equally distributed. So those above 1 are have more tendency to develop fever after neuroendoscopic procedure. So yeah, just a way of analyzing these data, showing them in a visual way. It's a simple message, but a simple message still is a message. The key message of this paper was you shouldn't worry too much if you have fever after a neuroendoscopic procedure, especially if it's in the first 2 days and if the child is not ill. Don't worry, just observe them. Don't send them home. Observe them for 1 or 2 more days, and most of them will be fine. So it's a key message, simple message. Nevertheless, it was something new, something that was not in the literature, something that was worth reporting. So that's how to bring your idea into a paper. Remember, making a PowerPoint presentation first is a very good tip for me. It works perfectly. And then presenting it to an audience in order to see whether the message can be communicated that way. Now, very briefly, a few slides, some writing tips. I already told you, be clear and concise, be consistent with the journal's guidelines, read and read and read again. I have the very sick habit of when I start writing again next day, I read everything I already wrote again. Next day, I continue. I start it's like it's like obsessive, but I read and read and read again, and there's always one or two sentences you can make better. You can so improve. It's like a painter continuously improving his painting. That way you should be continuously improving your paper. Then spelling and grammar. Not all of us are perfect spellers or perfect specialists in grammar. For me, it has always been something I really like to work on, but we have some automated spelling checks that can be of great help. Grammar checks are still much more difficult, and you still need a native English speaker to help you with that. Also there, the rule is check and check again. Spelling and grammar errors, I told you I review a lot of papers, and when there are a lot of spelling and grammar errors, and when there's an overall lack of structure in the submitted paper, this distracts me from my main task. This distracts me from providing a critical analysis, and also, which is a very important part of the reviewing process, it prevents me from providing useful feedback. I get lost in the spelling and grammar errors. So if you submit a paper, please try to have a good spelling and a correct grammar so the reviewer can do his or her job and really focus on the content. That's really a message, I think, an important message. Readers, you shouldn't forget, they tend to be tired. They tend to be in a hurry because you don't have time to read during daily hours. You have to read at night or in a train or on the plane, just when you have a little time, spare time. So they tend to be tired. They tend to be in a hurry. They may easily lose focus and they may easily be confused. So you have to be clear, concise. It should be a story that you tell, a story that is easy to follow, and you should be consistent in your choice of words. You either call a thing a disc herniation or you call it a herniated disc. You don't call it disc herniation and then in the next paragraph a herniated disc and in the third paragraph a prolapse. This will confuse the reader and it will make the reader more tired. Call it a patient or a subject or a case if you want, but don't call it all three in the same paper. Avoid passive verbs. Active sentences are shorter, clearer, less boring. When we talk to each other, it's with active sentences. When we write, we tend to switch to passive sentences, but try to avoid that. Make it active. It reads much more easily. Not the experiment was conducted, we conducted an experiment. Not the method was recommended by X, no, X recommended the method. And also use strong verbs. We performed an analysis. No, we analyzed. We made a measurement. Much too long. We measured. Keep it simple. Keep it easy to read. Keep it short and simple. Eliminate redundant words. During the course of the experiment, you read that so many times, but you can just say during our experiment. Omit words that don't add anything. Data were analyzed, not the data were analyzed. And wordy phrases. It is very interesting to note, interestingly, or one of the problems, one problem we encountered. So write it in different ways, and often it's best to choose the tightest one. Parallel structure is a very important thing to remember. Parallel structure, it relates to sentences, but also to entire paragraphs. It's a thing I have always very consciously used in my papers. If you say something like the first patient presented after a trauma with severe headaches, and then you go on with the second patient, then you say exactly the same thing. The second patient presented after with, and not, however, our second case came in with after. So it's much more confusing if the sentence is formulated differently. If the sentences are formulated exactly the same, it's much, much easier to see, now he's discussing A, now he's discussing the second case, now he's discussing the third case. The readers are tired and you should help them. And you can do the same thing with paragraphs. Parallel structure, if you are discussing groups of data, the A group that was not operated, the B group that was operated maybe after 2 days, and the C group that was operated after a week, try to structure those 3 paragraphs in an identical way. It will really make reading much easier and much more agreeable. Paragraphs should ideally discuss one main idea, one main topic. If not, consider splitting the paragraph, making 2 short paragraphs because when there are too many ideas wrapped in one paragraph, it's not correct. It's also not easy to understand. And you may consider telling what to expect at the beginning of the paragraph. Like, two problems with this technique are X and Y, and then you go on with X, and then you continue with Y. Headings and subheadings. Many papers I reviewed, I remember many papers for child's nervous system. For some reason, there were like lengthy discussions without any subheadings. And often the structure is inside the paper. It often took me only 10 minutes, 15 minutes to just go through it a few times and then say, you could make a subheading here, and you could make a subheading before the next paragraph. So often the structure was already in the paper, because obviously when you write it down, you have a structure in your head. You're going from A to Z over B, C, D, E. But many authors forget to visualize that structure. So don't forget to put these headings and subheadings in your paper. You may write the discussion and then go over it again and ask yourself, couldn't I put a subheading to indicate what the next paragraph will be about? And this makes the paper much, much more easy to read and to understand. And then something that may not be in any book, but something that's really, really, for me, important. If you are talking about adults, you can call them patients. But if you're talking about children, especially below 12 years of age, I don't want you to use the term patients in your paper. We operated 12 patients. No, you operated 12 children. Please. This is, for me, a no-go. So vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words. A paragraph, no unnecessary sentences. For the same reason, a drawing should not have any unnecessary lines, and a machine should not have any unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer makes all sentences short, so you can have long sentences, or avoid all detail and treat subjects only in outline, but it requires that every word tell. So ask yourself, are the words I'm using, are they really necessary? Do they tell, do they add to the story? I already told you this. You have to proofread over and over again, make the story flow, ask someone else at some point to read it and to give you his or her comments, and then avoid some common pitfalls. One of the pitfalls, and I may be doing that right now, so I ask you my apology, don't overstate your finding significance. Overstating is not good. Just be sober and just tell the story. Also, omitting your sources. If you say something and you omit to reference it, this may be considered plagiarism. Sometimes you copy-paste a few sentences from another paper. Nothing wrong with that, as long as you put the reference, then it's not a problem. Also, neglecting journals guidelines. This may cost you a lot of time when you have to correct for. And then mixing up references. You write, you rewrite, you copy-paste, you reshuffle your paper, and all too easily references get mixed up as well. So you need to do a final check at the end before submitting. And this brings me to my conclusion. Look in your daily clinical practice for an original idea. Don't repeat with your paper research that has already been published, unless when it's very recent and your data actually adds something to that bulk of research to prove that one single point. But go and look for an original idea, the gap of knowledge. Consider making a presentation first, team up early, discuss who is going to do what and who will be where in the paper, who will be the first, the second, and the final author. In your introduction, go for a clear hypothesis and research question. In your material and methods, details that allow replication. In your results, be clear and concise. In your discussion, do your interpretation, not in your results, only in your discussion. Conclusion should be to the point, and abstract should be rephrased at the end of the writing process using key phrases from the different parts of your paper. You check your spelling, you check your grammar over and over again. If necessary, you ask a native English speaker. Be clear, concise, and consistent, and don't forget to check that you have cited all sources to avoid plagiarism. And remember, finally, readers and also reviewers, they like a well-structured and a well-illustrated paper. That's what I wanted to share with you. That is, yeah, the way I have always done my scientific writing. Thank you for your attention.
Very good, Erwin. I think that was a very nice overview. Uh, I have a couple of questions. Maybe of those who want to ask questions, just write them in the chat. My question is, I think the most difficult thing is to find a good idea. You know, when we look at clinical data, we frequently have the situation that people tend to just summarize another 100. Let's
Yeah,
do a classic disc herniation.
yeah,
And to find the particular part, what is important, you should focus on. It's sometimes very difficult.
yeah.
So what is your strategy to find a good idea? For example, I mean, is it just an impression you have, or you get the idea by looking at your data or by reading something, or what is how do you find the idea? What is particular in your presentation, in your paper?
Yeah. I'm happy to you bring up that point again. So I think I made a good point. Um, First of all, I agree with you that all too often research is repeating itself. Oh, they published 100 cases. We have 95 as well. We will publish our cases as well. And this adds to the bulk of the literature. And of course, it's good to see that results can be replicated in another center. But maybe also to have this huge series, you have to be a big center. Or you have to do a multi-center trial. And you know, multi-center trials are even more difficult to do, and you can't do them as casually as a single center trial. You have to start thinking about the idea a long time before actually the concept and then the writing starts. So if you are a small center or a single center, then maybe the force will not be in the number of data, but in a well-chosen topic. And this takes a good clinician. Often maybe the young enthusiast specialists, but also the very experienced ones, like my mentor, Professor Bulls. He taught me how to have that clinical eye on yeah, to find something nobody else has talked about. There's just one thing that pops up as a pediatric neurosurgeon. We all know the dermal sinus, and we know they can infect and they can give a meningitis. And therefore, you have to close a dermal sinus early after birth. But not all of them infect. As a matter of fact, most of them don't. And then we started looking more carefully, and we saw that you have the open dermal sinuses, which are the real ones, where there is an invagination from the skin with epithelium going through the dura towards the intradural space, but it's closed, it's not connected with the arachnoid, therefore there's no CSF running, but you have a fistula going transdurally. But another group, the skin lesion was actually closed. So you had a dimple, but it was closed. You couldn't put anything in. You couldn't go in. So that was not a shaft. And then we call that a dermal sinus-like stalk. We were the first to observe that difference. It's just a clinical observation. But once you make that observation, you realize not all dermal sinuses are dermal sinuses. There is a second entity which is closed but looks exactly the same on MRI. So it's just um, critically looking at your cases and also having that scientific mind, asking yourself, why are some going infected and why are so many not going infected? And the answer was actually very easy. Those that are open with a real fistula, they can get infected. Those that are closed, they are actually a separate entity. They are not real dermal sinuses. And now everybody is using that distinction. But at the time, it was new. So it was a clinical observation. And my message to the young audience would be, you don't need to have great numbers. Don't need the strength is not always in the big numbers, but in the good and solid clinical observations. But it's something you have to train, you have to learn. And again, going through your data, completing your database, as I explained in the beginning of my talk, You will always encounter one or two special cases, unique cases, different cases. Put them aside. Well, put them, of course, in the paper. Don't put them outside, but make a special mark, and maybe you can have a second paper on that very specific or unique case. I've always been like that. I'm always on the look for something new, something unique, some new observation. And believe me, there are so many things still to observe that haven't been discussed in literature. Well, it's not that difficult to find them, but you have to have an open mind. And of course, you have to know your literature in order to pick in at the right moment. Like we picked in with the Blake's pouch, we picked in at the right moment. There was at some point I discovered that entity. The first time I read about it, I didn't know it. At some point I read about it in an overview paper on posterior fossa malformations. And then I looked in PubMed, and then I realized very fast, nobody has ever talked about the single entity of Blake's pouch. And then we had 6 cases, and that was enough to write it down. So that's my answer, Joachim. There's no single way of finding it, but it's opening your eyes and always trying to collect these interesting cases, yeah, and putting them aside so you don't forget at some point to start writing about it. I don't see the questions. I don't know how I can. You see them?
So there is a couple of questions in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is about the how big should the gap of knowledge be in order to be filled or not? Well, this is
that's an easy question.
No, it's very difficult. I think you answer. You answer.
I don't think it needs to be a big gap. Every gap is a gap. And if you don't close it with sound scientific data, it will still be a gap. So either you fill it with scientific data, or you don't fill it, and then you say, well, this is a small gap, I just fill it with my intuition, but that's not science. So for me, every gap is a gap. Yeah. Of course, you want your message to be relevant. You want it to be interesting. You want it to attract readers' attention. It needs to be publishing you should not publish to publish. You need a message. In that way, it's a difficult question, a very small gap. But still, on the other hand, if you have something to tell, if you have some evidence nobody else has ever shown or analyzed or shared, then it's worthwhile publishing. Don't you agree, Joachim?
The problem is that the majority of readers have to agree that this is a gap which should be closed. You know, I mean, there might be a gap from your perspective, and you write a paper on what is, you know, a big question in your idea, but because nobody else has, you know, this question, it might not, you know, fulfill the requirements for being published. So gap is difficult. We have, I think, 2 more questions. The next one is about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So the question is if you believe that really young research benefit from AI or they do not. I mean, does it make the papers better or not? And well, that's a good question for you, because I have a very strong meaning about this. And you go ahead.
Then we may differ in our meaning, maybe. What do I say? Let me be those of you that hear the talk. You see, I like words. I like talking. I like writing science, not writing a book or prosa, but writing science. I have something with words and with grammar and with languages, but not everybody has that. And I see in my children, one of my sons is also studying medicine, they are less proficient in reading and writing. And I found that painful at first because I thought there is so much beauty in words and in writing and expressing your thoughts. But then I started realizing times are changing. Times are changing. We live in the 21st century. We have AI, we have computers. And my first papers I wrote, they were written, handwritten. I mean, so things are changing so rapidly, and the youth brain is working differently. They're much faster in doing an internet search and in connecting different papers and in statistics, and so they have their own talents, but they may be, and I don't want to shock anybody, but they may be less um, fluent in putting their thoughts into nice long sentences with correct spelling and correct grammar. But that doesn't make them any worse researchers. So it's not a shame that I can write a nice paper in correct English without AI, but probably also not a shame if somebody else writes a nice paper that is readable and understandable in correct English using the benefits of AI. So therefore, if you use it correctly, I think it can be of great help also for the non-native English speakers. Again, if I get a paper which is written in correct grammar and spelling, as a reviewer, I can focus on the content and I can start a little bit reshuffling the paper and give some good criticism to make the paper better. But if I start with a crippled paper with a lot of mistakes, then as a reviewer, I am lost, and I find it very difficult to spend my time trying to make it a better paper. So I'm not against it, but for me, it's difficult to oversee where we will be in 5 years, where we will be in 10 years. But I'm an optimist rather than a pessimist, and I think um, we should use the technology for the best. That's my opinion, but I don't have personal experience. Now, your opinion, Joachim, I'm very curious.
The main problem is that, you know, the artificial intelligence, at least in those who I have been in contact with, is used to not at the end, you know, to give proof that your paper is well prepared. It's used in the beginning, and this is the wrong thing.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think I think the question, the idea, has to come out of your knowledge. You know, if you don't have the knowledge, you cannot write a paper on a condition you're not really are aware of. So what frequently happens is basically you have an idea and then you use artificial intelligence to give you an idea what exactly might be a question, and that's not good. And this reflects, I think, the right now when I review the papers, quality is not good. It's because a lot of it's not the English, it's rather that there's not an interesting scientific question. And I
Yeah, yeah.
think the first steps of preparing a paper have to be done using you know, your knowledge, and you have to have this knowledge, and then you can use artificial intelligence maybe for some discussion if it's not easy, and you know, some aspects.
Yeah.
Anyway,
With that, I agree, Joachim. Yeah, you're completely right. Yeah.
so we have to move on. We close this session now. You all got the invitation for the 30 minutes now, is that right? Then we have to log in for the second, and I just have to use the restroom. So we meet in 30 seconds, okay? The other
Okay.
log in, the other
Yeah,
log
yeah.
in.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Bye-bye. See you.